Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Unbound Season 2, The Weight of Truth. I'm Beth Curry, and we're on episode 2 already. If you made it through the last episode, you survived the heaviest chapter in this entire season, and it was the first one. Whoopsie. Today we're going back further to where all of this started, to the fat kid I was before I became the woman, Googling pill counts. This is chapter 2 in the book, The Fat Kid Foundation. Before I was Googling ways to die, I was a fat kid who learned that food was love. Attention was earned, and my body was wrong. Not different, not bigger, wrong. I grew up lower middle class, much lower, which meant a lot of things, but mostly it meant my parents were too busy working their asses off to keep us housed and fed to worry about whether what they were feeding us was actually good for us. Nutrition wasn't a luxury we could afford to think about. Food was fuel, and cheap fuel at that. This was the 1980s when the entire world had lost its goddamn mind about fat. Everything was low fat and fat free, and we were all supposed to believe that removing fat from food and replacing it with sugar and chemicals was somehow healthier. My mom, bless her heart, was doing her best with what she knew. She bought Snackwell's cookies because they were fat free. She gave us bagels for breakfast because carbs were good and fat was bad. She fed us pasta with sugary tomato sauce and called it a balanced meal. We got shreddies covered in brown sugar too. Nobody told us that when you remove fat from food, you have to add something else to make it taste good again. And that something else was usually sugar, corn syrup, or some chemical concoction that made us hungrier than we were before we ate. Nobody told us that eating a giant bagel for breakfast would spike our blood sugar so high we'd crash by 10 and be ravenous for more carbs. Nobody told us that low fat usually meant high sugar, and that sugar was turning our bodies into fat storing machines. But more than that, nobody told us that food wasn't supposed to be the answer to every emotion. When I was sad, there was ice cream. When I was celebrating, there was cake. When I was bored, there were chips. When I was stressed, there was whatever was easiest and fastest and would shut up the noise in my head for a few minutes. Food became my therapist, my best friend, my reward system, and my punishment, all rolled into one. It was the most reliable relationship I had because it never said no, never judged me, never asked for anything back except money we didn't have much of anyway. Being a fat kid shaped my identity in ways I'm still unpacking decades later. I became the funny one because if I made people laugh, they might forget to notice my body. I became the smart one because if I was useful enough, valuable enough, maybe they'd overlook the fact that I took up too much space. I became the people pleaser because I learned early that fat kids don't get to be difficult. We have to be grateful for any attention, any inclusion, any scrap of acceptance we can get. I also became the vulnerable one, which one predator managed to discover, and for most of my teen years I was manipulated and abused by him. This of course led to even more eating, ultimately a binge eating disorder, and even more weight gain. This time to protect myself and make myself repulsive. I learned to read a room faster than other kids because I had to assess the threat level. Would these people be kind? Would they ignore me? Would they make jokes? I developed a sixth sense for where the danger was coming from and how to minimize it. I picked up early on the get them before they get me method of self-deprecation, but make it funny so everyone would laugh. I learned to shrink emotionally even though I couldn't shrink physically. I learned to apologize for existing too loudly, taking up too much space, needing things that other kids got without asking. And I learned that love, attention, even basic respect were things I had to work extra hard for. Other kids got these things just for being themselves. I had to earn them by being funnier, smarter, more helpful, more giving, more anything that would distract from the fact that I was fat. The fucked up thing is that it worked, sort of. I did develop character. I did become resilient. I did learn to be funny and smart and helpful. But I also learned that my worth was conditional, that my body was shameful, and that I better bring something extra to the table because just being me wasn't enough. By the time I was a teenager, this foundation was so solid, I didn't even question it anymore. Of course I was the fat friend. Of course I was grateful for any attention. Of course I ate my feelings. That's what food was for, right? I spent my childhood building an identity around being the fat kid who made up for it by being everything else. And by the time I was an adult, I was so committed to that identity that changing it felt like losing myself entirely, which, as it turns out, was exactly what I needed to do. But first, I had to figure out which parts of what I'd been taught about food, bodies, and worth were complete bullshit. Spoiler alert, most of it. Real talk questions. What role did you play in your family to avoid talking about your weight? Were you the funny one, the helpful one, the smart one, the invisible one? Notice how much energy you've spent your whole life trying to distract people from your body. That energy could have been used for literally anything else. What food myths from childhood are you still believing? Breakfast is the most important meal of the day? You have to clean your plate? Dessert is a reward for good behavior? Low fat means healthy? Write down every food rule you've learned as a kid, and I guarantee half of them are keeping you stuck because they're absolute bull roar. When did you first learn that your body was wrong? Who taught you that? This one's going to hurt, but you need to know where the shame started. Was it a parent, a kid at school, a doctor, a mirror? You can't heal what you won't acknowledge. You don't need to place blame or hate. You are simply acknowledging who or what taught you that. Truth bomb exercise. Write down every diet rule you learned growing up. Cross out the bullshit. Here's what mine looked like after I crossed out the lines. I crossed out breakfast is the most important meal of the day. I crossed out you have to eat 3 meals a day. I crossed out fat makes you fat. I crossed out carbs are good for energy. I crossed out don't eat after 8 p.m. I did not cross out listen to your hunger cues. I crossed out clean your plate. I crossed out dessert as a reward. I did not cross out eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full. Turns out most of what we learned about food was marketing disguised as nutrition, and most of what we learned about our bodies was shame disguised as concern. The foundation you built as a fat kid doesn't have to be the house you live in as an adult. But you can't build something new until you admit that what you're standing on is cracked. So let's start cracking. So that was pretty cheesy. The 1980s low-fat craze was, I think, one of the biggest scams ever pulled on the American public, and honestly on most of the Western world. We were sold on this idea that fat was the enemy when really we should have been looking at sugar and processed carbs the entire time. But there was money to be made in fat-free products, and that's what you got. There's also money to be made in being fat, in being obese. Pharmaceutical companies, the entire medical establishment, everybody's making money off of obesity. Everybody and beyond. But yeah, the fat-free products, Snackwell's cookies and fat-free yogurt, loaded with sugar, bagels the size of your head, marketed as healthy breakfast options, like insane. My mom, honestly, she thought she was doing the right thing. She was following the advice of the doctors and the nutritionists and every magazine article that promised if we just cut out the fat, we would pretty much all be thin and healthy. Like, she didn't know that she was setting us up for insulin resistance and blood sugar crashes and constant cravings. Nobody knew, right? And look at how society has changed since the 80s. If somebody did know, though, they didn't care because I guess there was just too much profit in keeping us sick and hungry. And we know this to be fact today. But what I really want to talk about, the roles that we played to survive being fat kids. I asked in the chapter what role you played. For me, it was being funny, smart, and helpful, the triple threat of distraction techniques. And it worked. Some people liked me. I had friends. I wasn't the kid who got bullied every single day, though it definitely happened sometimes. But the cost of that survival strategy was, enormous. I spent so much energy managing other people's perception of me that I never learned who I actually was underneath all that performance. I was so busy being useful and funny and being the person everyone could count on. I forgot I was allowed to just be me, to take up space without being sorry for it, to need things without earning the right to need them first. And that bit I mentioned about becoming vulnerable and attracting a predator, I don't talk about that often. It is part of my story. It's season 3. It's going to be season 3. When you're a fat kid who's taught your body is shameful and you're lucky to get any attention at all, you become a target for people who understand that vulnerability and they know exactly how to exploit it. The abuse I experienced as a teenager compounded everything I already believed about myself and sent me further into food as protection and comfort and the only thing I could control when everything else felt dangerous, That is when the binge eating disorder really took hold. It wasn't just emotional eating anymore. It was compulsive and it was secretive and it was desperate eating. Eating to numb out, eating to disappear inside myself, eating to make my body so repulsive that no one would hurt me again. Except I was hurting myself, every single day, every single binge. The truth bomb exercise about crossing out diet rules, I want you to actually do that because it's interesting. And I'd love to hear, from anyone in the Facebook group or anything, any weird diet rules that you still believe today. Just get a piece of paper and write it down. Every food rule you learned growing up, look at them. How many of them are actually based in science versus marketing? How many are really about health versus control? How many of them have kept you trapped in cycles of restriction and binging or dieting while starving to death? Excuse me. Most of what we learned about food was designed to sell products, not to make us healthy. And most of what we learned about our bodies was designed to keep us ashamed and not to help us heal. You can't build a healthy relationship with food and your body on a foundation of lies and shame. It's impossible. You have to dig down. You have to find out where the cracks are. You have to acknowledge them, and you have to decide what you're going to build instead. The foundation that I built as a fat kid, funny, smart, helpful, grateful for scraps. It kept me alive through childhood. It got me through some really hard years, but it was never meant to be permanent. It was survival architecture, not a place to live forever. The work now is kind of figuring out who you are when you're not performing and not earning your worth and not apologizing for existing. Who are you when you are just you? That's the work. And it's harder than any diet you'll ever try. Do it. I dare ya. We're going to wrap things up here. If you want to discuss this episode, there's a Facebook group where you can connect with others. The link's in the show notes. All my content is free because access to these stories shouldn't depend on your ability to pay. If you want to support, the information on how to do that is in the show notes. I also accept e-transfer or PayPal. Just reach out for details. Thank you so much for being here. Good luck if you're working along with this, and I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.